Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. There's a certain comfort in routine. It's predictable, safe, like the way Marcia and I moved through the world we built. Our marriage started the way most love stories do, full of promise, laughter, and whispered dreams under the covers late at night. We met in college, two wide-eyed kids swept up in the current of ambition and affection. She was as radiant as the sun, her laughter a melody I could pick out in any crowd. I was the nerdy IT guy who, against all odds, caught the attention of the girl who lit up the room. We grew together, built a life full of shared milestones. First jobs, the purchase of our modest home, and eventually, the arrival of our two children. There were vacations to the beach where the kids' laughter blended with the crash of waves, and quiet evenings at home filled with stories and spilled bowls of popcorn. 12 years passed in a blink, and with them, the comfortable illusion that what we had was unbreakable. But illusions have a way of cracking when you're not looking. The first sign was subtle, almost insignificant, a missed kiss goodbye before I left for work. It stung, but I brushed it off. Marcia's days were packed with meetings at her job, the stresses of project deadlines, and late nights where her voice, soft over the phone, told me she was just finishing up. I wanted to believe her, to believe that her sighs were from exhaustion, not from the boredom of routine or the excitement of someone else. I'm not proud of how long I ignored the signs. Maybe it was easier that way, believing everything was still as it had always been. A man can convince himself of anything if it means holding on to what he treasures. But the distance between us grew more pronounced. She was there, yet not. The air between us felt charged with something unsaid, something more than stress. The moment that shifted everything came quietly, almost as if fate had nudged it into place. One late evening, Marcia had turned in early, claiming a headache. The kids were already asleep, and the house hummed with that rare stillness that only comes after a long day. I sat at my desk, half-heartedly working on a code review, when her phone lit up on the dresser beside our bed. My eyes flicked to it reflexively, expecting nothing. But there it was, a message from accounting. "Can't wait to taste you again tomorrow, baby." It didn't buzz, didn't chime, silent, as if the words themselves knew they were forbidden. I sat there, stunned. The message scrolled across the screen as casually as a weather update, only it was a storm that was tearing through everything I thought I knew. My mind spun, heart pounding as I fought to stay rational, fought to cling to disbelief. But that simple, damning sentence was a guillotine blade, severing me from the life I had believed in. I confronted her as soon as she emerged from the bathroom, robe wrapped loosely around her, hair still damp from a rushed shower. The denial was immediate, predictable. Her eyes darted, searching for a foothold to steady herself against the truth I had caught mid-fall. But I knew what I saw. We stood in the middle of our dim bedroom, the silence thick as she tried to weave her web, thin threads of explanations that snapped one by one under the weight of reality. "It's just work," she stammered, hands twisting the edge of her robe. "You know how these guys talk, it's nothing." "Is that so?" My voice, cold, as if it belonged to someone else, cut through her defense. "Because nothing doesn't sound like it's making plans for tomorrow." She flinched, and for the first time, I saw the crack in her composure, the guilt that flared hot and then dimmed, replaced by an almost defiant silence. She didn't admit it then, not fully. The truth trickled out over weeks, eroded by relentless questions, half-answers, and her eventual confession that left me reeling. Marcia had met him at a company event months back, a few too many drinks, laughter that lingered past the closing remarks. "It was, just once," she said at first. Then, "It was a mistake." But each version of her story unraveled until the cold facts stood alone. It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice she made over and over. I stared at the woman I had loved, had built a life with, and felt the sharp sting of betrayal twist into something deeper. It wasn't just what she had done, it was the lies, the theft of our shared moments. Every late night when she claimed to be stuck at work, she wasn't just gone, she was somewhere else entirely, choosing him over the life we had. There was a night when, after another round of broken confessions and my silence that followed, she reached out, as if to mend the rift with a touch. I was lonely, she whispered, as if that could excuse the cracks in the foundation. My laugh was harsh, almost involuntary. I pushed her hand away and left the room, the echo of her words haunting the space long after I closed the door behind me. I spent that night on the couch, staring at the ceiling, memories unspooling in my mind like old film reels, moments that once meant everything, now just echoes of a story that felt fictional. This was not the life I had signed up for, not the ending I imagined. And yet, as the night wore on, something steely settled in my chest. If she had made her choice, then it was time for me to make mine. Days turned into weeks and the weight of betrayal didn't lessen, it sharpened, slicing through every interaction. I moved through my daily routine as if it were a pantomime, smiling at my kids' stories and nodding at work meetings, while beneath it all, my thoughts roared with questions that had no answers. The drive to know why still gnawed at me, despite Marcia's myriad of excuses. There were no real explanations, just the tired tropes of needing something more, of loneliness in a life she painted as suffocating. None of it absolved her. Marcia, meanwhile, put on a show of contrition. She cooked meals with forced cheer, lingered at the edges of rooms with eyes that begged for my gaze. I couldn't meet them for long. Each glance felt like staring into the aftermath of a fire, the remnants of something that once stood solid and now lay smoldering. One evening, after a hollow dinner where conversation clattered as awkwardly as our cutlery, she finally broke the silence that had become our uninvited guest. "Mark, please, can we talk?" Her voice, usually so confident, wavered like a kite in windless air. I didn't respond immediately. The kids had retreated to their rooms, the soft thrum of a video game in the background. The house was alive with noise, but between us, there was only that suffocating quiet. "What is there to say that hasn't been said?" I replied, leaning back in my chair. The exhaustion in my tone surprised even me. She stepped closer, her hand brushing against the table's edge as if needing the support. "I know I messed up. I know that saying sorry isn't enough, but I don't want to lose everything we've built." Her eyes were wide, the gleam of tears threatening to spill. It should have moved me, perhaps months ago it would have, but now I just felt hollow. "Everything we built?" I repeated, the bitterness palpable. "You built something with him, too, didn't you? How long did it take before you started telling him the things you once told me?" The words lashed out, harsh and sharp. Her lips trembled, the facade of calm crumbling. "I wasn't trying to replace you, Mark. It was never about that. It was." I raised a hand, cutting off her words. "It was what, Marcia? About you? About feeling alive? Don't try to dress this up as anything noble. It was selfish. Just admit it." She sank into the chair across from me, fingers nervously knotting in her lap. It was a mistake that spiraled. I kept thinking I could stop. That one more time would be the last. But I couldn't, her voice choked, trailing into silence as she covered her face with her hands. I wanted to shout, to upend the table, to expel the rage that seethed beneath the surface. But instead, I found myself standing up, the movement slow and deliberate. "You did stop," I said, voice flat. "And so did I." With that, I walked out, letting the quiet thud of the door punctuate my exit. Outside, the cool night air bit into my skin, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat in the house. The stars above blinked indifferently, tiny and cold. I took a deep breath and leaned against the hood of my car, letting the silence soak in. It wasn't peace, but it was close. The following days were a test of endurance. Marcia continued her attempts at reconciliation, a hand on my arm as I passed, meals prepared with almost desperate diligence, soft-spoken "I love yous" that fell like leaves in the wind, heard but not absorbed. The kids sensed the tension, their voices dropping when we were in the same room, their eyes darting between us as if gauging the safety of our silence. Then, one night, I found myself at the local bar, a place I hadn't visited in years. It was an impulse, a need to escape the suffocating pretense of home. The bartender, a gray-haired man with a friendly nod, poured my drink without comment. I sat at the end, watching the amber liquid catch the light, and let the low hum of strangers' conversations wash over me. "Mark, right?" The voice was familiar, warm with recognition. I turned to see David, an old friend from college days, now a lawyer, with an easy smile and an understanding nod. We hadn't spoken in years, more acquaintances than friends by this point, but he slid onto the stool next to me like no time had passed. "Been a while," I said, my voice thick with the first real spark of camaraderie I'd felt in months. He chuckled. "Yeah, it has. You look like a man who's had a hell of a year. Mind if I join?" He gestured at the seat. I nodded, managing a faint smile. It didn't take long for the conversation to turn honest. David had always been good at cutting through the surface, and tonight, I found myself grateful for it. "So, what's the real story, Mark?" he asked after a few shared laughs and half a drink. I stared into my glass, watching the ice shift. "Marcia cheated," I said, the bluntness surprising me. It was the first time I'd said it out loud to anyone. David exhaled slowly, leaning back. "Damn. That's rough. And the kids? They don't know." "Yet," I added, the weight of that truth settling in my chest. "I'm not even sure how to tell them, or if I should." He nodded, the sympathy in his eyes sincere. "It's not easy. But you don't have to go through it alone. I mean it, if you need anything, advice, just someone to vent to, call me. Don't let this eat you alive, man." We sat in silence for a moment before he changed the subject, pulling the conversation back to lighter memories of late-night study sessions and college antics. For the first time in what felt like years, I laughed, a real, genuine laugh that felt foreign and raw in my throat. When I got home that night, the house was quiet. Marcia had waited up, her figure illuminated by the soft glow of the kitchen light. She glanced at me, eyes shadowed with a question she didn't dare voice. "Where were you?" she asked, the words tentative, testing the fragile thread of civility between us. "Out," I said simply, hanging my jacket and brushing past her without waiting for more. Her silence followed me down the hall, a reminder that some distances can't be measured, only felt. The days bled into one another, an endless loop of pretended normalcy and barely contained resentment. I woke up each morning to the sounds of life moving on, birds calling outside the window, the muffled thud of my son's footsteps as he bounded down the stairs, the gentle hiss of Marcia's voice as she whispered reminders to the kids. It all felt surreal, as if I were watching my life through a one-way mirror, separated by an invisible barrier that kept me from feeling part of it. The kids, Emma and Noah, knew something was wrong. Children have an uncanny ability to sense tension, even if they don't understand its roots. Emma, our oldest at 10, had stopped asking why Mom and Dad no longer watched movies together in the living room. Noah, only 7, would crawl into bed with me on the nights Marcia retreated to the guest room. He didn't say much, just pressed his small body against mine, a silent attempt to push back the creeping cold that had settled into our home. One night, after another dinner filled with brittle silences and tight-lipped smiles, I found Emma waiting for me outside my office. Her eyes were wide, the blue of them darkened by the questions swirling behind them. "Dad, are you and Mom mad at each other?" she asked, voice small but steady. I felt the familiar ache in my chest, a tightening that made it hard to breathe. How do you explain betrayal to a child who still believes the world is simple and fair? I crouched down, putting my hands on her shoulders. "Your mom and we're going through something tough right now. But we both love you and Noah very much. That will never change." The words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Emma nodded, accepting the half-truth, but her expression said she wasn't convinced. After she padded back to her room, I sat in the dark of my office, fingers drumming absently on the desk. The silence of the house pressed against my ears, deafening and insistent. It was in those moments that the urge to take control surged in me. I had spent too long feeling like the victim, trapped in the narrative Marcia's choices had written for us. But I knew that if I didn't act, I would lose more than just a marriage, I'd lose myself. The plan started taking shape the following day. It wasn't driven by a desire for reconciliation or even revenge, but rather a need to reclaim my agency. I reached out to a private investigator I'd heard about from David during our bar conversation. The idea made me feel uneasy, like I was stepping into a role I didn't recognize, but I pushed the discomfort aside. I needed clarity, even if it meant confronting more truths that would hurt. His name was Cole, a former cop turned PI with a no-nonsense demeanor and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. We met in a coffee shop downtown, its quiet hum the perfect cover for uncomfortable discussions. "So, what are we looking for, Mark?" Cole's voice was low, professional, without a hint of judgment. "Confirmation," I said, swirling the black coffee in my cup. "Proof that this thing with Marcia, it wasn't a one-time mistake. I need to know what I'm dealing with." He nodded, pulling out a small notepad. "I'll need her schedule, details of her habits, work hours, places she frequents. The more, the better." I slid a file across the table, everything meticulously laid out, her workplace, the days she claimed to work late, even the names of a few colleagues I suspected might know more than they let on. Cole glanced through it and nodded again, tucking the folder away. "I'll be in touch," he said, standing up with a slight tip of his head. The next week passed in a haze of anticipation and nerves. I caught myself glancing at my phone too often, half hoping, half dreading a message from Cole. Marcia's behavior oscillated between desperate attempts at rekindling our life and periods of brooding silence. She'd cook elaborate meals, leave notes on the kitchen counter that said things like "we can make this work" or "I miss us." Each one felt like a weight pressing down on my chest, guilt mingling with anger. Finally, after days of waiting, my phone buzzed with a simple text: "We need to meet." "Found something." The words churned my stomach, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. We met at the same coffee shop, though this time, Cole's expression was more guarded. "It's not good news," he said, sliding an envelope toward me. Inside were photos, each one sharper than the last. Marcia standing too close to a man I recognized from her office, his hand brushing hers, their expressions too familiar. Another shot showed them leaving a restaurant, laughing. But the worst was a grainy image taken through a hotel window, silhouettes that were unmistakable. My hand tightened around the table edge, knuckles white. The world seemed to tilt, every heartbeat a painful echo in my chest. The coffee shop faded away, replaced by a rush of memories, Marcia smiling over her morning coffee, the feel of her hand in mine, the laughter we used to share. It was all tainted now, marred by these images that proved what I feared most: her betrayal ran deeper than I'd let myself imagine. "Do you want to confront her?" Cole's voice cut through the storm in my head. I looked up at him, eyes burning but dry. "Not yet," I said, voice barely more than a whisper. "I need to think." I spent that night in the guest room, the envelope clutched in my hands like a lifeline. Sleep eluded me, replaced by the relentless march of questions that led nowhere. By dawn, I knew I couldn't carry the weight alone anymore. It was time for Marcia to see what I'd seen, to face the truth she tried so hard to hide. When morning came, she was in the kitchen, the smell of toast and eggs filling the air. She looked up as I entered, eyes flicking over my disheveled appearance. Before she could speak, I placed the envelope on the table between us. "What's this?" she asked, the smile faltering. "Open it," I said, crossing my arms, every muscle tight as I waited for the moment to unfold. Her fingers hesitated over the flap, a breath caught in her chest. When she pulled out the photos, her face paled, lips parting in silent disbelief. The minutes stretched out, heavy and suffocating. "I'm sorry," she whispered, voice breaking. "I didn't. I never meant." "Don't," I interrupted, shaking my head. The rage I thought would come never did. Instead, there was only a cold, hollow space where it should have been. "I don't want apologies. I want honesty. No more lies, Marcia. It's over." She crumpled into the chair, eyes glossy with unshed tears, but I turned away. Outside, the sun was rising, painting the kitchen in warm hues that felt mocking. It was the start of a new day, and for the first time in months, I felt the stirrings of freedom beneath the heartbreak. The silence in the house after that confrontation was unlike anything I'd known. It was deeper, more profound, as if even the walls held their breath. Marcia moved through the days as if on autopilot, her presence a ghost of what it had been. She left notes less often, stopped attempting the desperate conversations, and retreated inward until she was little more than a shadow. Emma and Noah picked up on it, of course. They watched us carefully, their eyes wide with worry whenever I caught them staring. "I need to talk to you about something," Marcia said one evening. Her voice was small, fragile, as if it would shatter if spoken too loudly. I looked up from my place at the dining room table, the remains of a solitary meal scattered in front of me. The kids were at a friend's house, and the quiet was a heavy, stifling thing. "Go ahead," I said, trying to keep my voice even, to pretend this conversation didn't feel like a death knell. "I'm leaving," she said, the words punctuated by the sound of a car passing outside. "I think it's best for everyone if I stay with my sister for a while. I need to figure things out." The surge of emotion was unexpected, a twisted blend of relief and grief. I nodded slowly, not trusting myself to speak without breaking. She moved to the hallway, suitcase already packed, and paused at the door, turning back for a moment. Her eyes were swollen and red, raw with everything she'd carried and everything I hadn't been able to forgive. "Tell the kids I love them," she whispered. I met her gaze, searching for the part of her I once knew, but it was buried beneath too many layers of hurt. Without another word, she left, and the click of the door was a final, unforgiving punctuation mark on our story. The first week after she left was brutal. Emma and Noah were confused, hurt by their mother's absence and my strained explanations. I tried to fill the void, making their favorite dinners, playing board games that once filled our nights with laughter. But every moment was colored by their unasked questions. "When will Mom be back? Why did she leave?" I dodged the answers as best I could, hoping that time would soften the sharp edges. But time, as it turned out, had its own cruelty. On a cold Friday evening, I was called to pick the kids up from school early. The principal met me at the door, her expression somber, eyes darting away from mine as if carrying a terrible secret. "There's been an accident," she said, her voice low, urgent. I felt my knees buckle, the ground shifting beneath me as she explained. Marcia had been driving home late, her car skidding off the road in the dark, headlights swallowed by the woods that lined the highway. They found her hours later, when it was too late for any miracle. The rest was a blur, a cold sterile room, a police officer's practiced condolences, the kids' shattered cries when I broke the news. Emma sobbed herself to sleep that night, fists clinging to her blanket, while Noah's silence gnawed at me. He sat beside me, eyes dry and vacant, his small hand gripping mine so tightly that I felt the bones ache. I didn't pull away. The funeral was a procession of faces I didn't recognize, people who knew Marcia from parts of her life I had never been part of. David came, stood quietly at the back with a look of profound sympathy. Marcia's sister sobbed uncontrollably, clutching the folded piece of paper that held her final messages to loved ones. I hadn't seen it, it was her private grief. I stood at the edge of the cemetery as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of red and purple that seemed almost cruel in their beauty. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it memories that tugged at the edges of my mind, the sound of her laughter, the way her eyes crinkled when she was genuinely happy, the nights we stayed up talking until dawn. I wondered if any of it had been real, or if those moments were always haunted by the ghosts of choices we hadn't seen coming. The kids stood beside me, Emma's sobs quieter now, Noah's small face set in a frown of confusion and pain. I reached out, pulled them both into an embrace, feeling the weight of their grief and mine. For the first time in weeks, I let the tears come, silent and unbidden. "I'm sorry," I whispered, not sure if I was talking to them, to Marcia, or to the memory of the life we once had. The days that followed were heavy with routines that felt wrong, spaces that felt emptier without her. I found one last note, wedged in the back of her desk drawer, forgotten or perhaps left intentionally for me to find. It was scrawled hastily, words smudged as if she'd written them through tears. "Mark, I know sorry isn't enough. I never wanted to hurt you. I loved you, once and always. Please forgive me one day, for the kid's sake. Marcia." I folded the note, tucked it into my pocket, and stepped outside where the winter wind stung my cheeks. The sky above was a deep, bruised blue, the kind that swallowed light. The kind that whispered of endings. The house behind me felt hollow, its rooms filled with shadows and echoes of things unsaid. But as I looked out over the yard, where Emma's bike lay abandoned and Noah's ball rolled with the breeze, I made a silent promise, to find a way to let go of the anger, to tell them stories of their mother that would bring smiles instead of tears. To let them remember the good, even if it meant carrying the sadness alone. In the end, it wasn't just Marcia who was gone, it was the version of us that once laughed and fought and dreamed. But standing there, I realized that moving forward didn't mean forgetting. It meant learning to carry the love and the loss side by side, one step at a time.